Welcome back to the channel. Today we are doing a full and complete breakdown of one of the most unique action films to come out of 2025, Prisoner of War. Now, before we get into anything, let me tell you right up front where this film comes from, who made it, and why it matters. Prisoner of War, which was formerly titled Death March, is a 2025 martial arts war film directed by Louis Mandylor and written by Mark Klebanoff, based on an original story developed by the film's lead actor, Scott Adkins himself. That detail alone is important because it tells you that this is a deeply personal project. This is not just another assignment Scott Adkins walked onto. He developed the story from scratch, which means everything you see on screen carries his own creative vision from the very beginning. The film was produced by Odyssey Motion Pictures along with Brandon Motion, Reality Studios, and Myriad Entertainment Corp., and it was distributed by Wellgo USA Entertainment. Wellgo USA is a distributor well known for releasing martial arts and action-heavy films in the American market, so this was absolutely the right home for a movie of this kind. The film was co-produced between the United States and the Philippines, and it was made in multiple languages including English, Filipino, and Japanese, which gives it a very authentic multilingual texture that perfectly fits the World War II setting. The cinematography was handled by Nicolo de la Fere, the editing was done by Austin Nordell, and the music score was composed by Tassos Eliopoulos. The total running time of the film is 112 minutes, making it a full and complete cinematic experience rather than just a short action showcase. This is a film that takes its time to build character, tension, and genuine human drama before delivering on all of its action promises. What truly makes this film stand out in the crowded action genre is its historical setting. The story is placed in 1942 during the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, a period that saw one of the most brutal and historically documented atrocities of the entire war, the Bataan Death March, where American, British, and Filipino prisoners of war were forced to walk 65 miles from one prison camp to another, and thousands of soldiers died along the way. This is the world the film drops you into, and it does not shy away from the weight and horror of that reality. It is rare to see a martial arts film rooted so deeply in actual historical events, and that is precisely what makes Prisoner of War feel fresh, grounded, and different from everything else in its genre. Plot details. Now let us get into the full story of the film. In April of 1942, during the Battle of Bataan in World War II, Royal Air Force Wing Commander James Wright is on a combat mission flying over the Philippines when his plane is shot down. He survives the crash but is almost immediately captured by Japanese forces on the ground. He is then transported to a prisoner of war camp in the Philippines, a place run with absolute cruelty and iron authority by Lieutenant Colonel Benjiro Ito. Inside this camp, Allied soldiers face forced labor, deliberate starvation, and daily physical brutality with no end in sight. When Wright first arrives, Ito orders his right-hand man, Captain Hirano, to execute the British officer. But Wright is not an ordinary prisoner. In a stunning display of combat ability, he kills Hirano and 2 additional soldiers before attempting to flee. He is quickly recaptured, but this incident changes everything. It draws direct attention from Ito, who begins to see Wright not just as a prisoner to be destroyed but as something far more interesting, a warrior. Wright soon learns that the camp officers have been running underground fighting matches where prisoners are forced to fight for the entertainment of their Japanese captors. Those who refuse to participate are simply executed. Wright, watching resistors die in front of him, eventually steps into the ring. What he brings to those matches is something the Japanese soldiers were not expecting. Years before the war, Wright had trained in martial arts in Hong Kong, and those techniques give him a significant advantage over every opponent placed in front of him. He defeats the best fighter in the entire camp, a man named Koji, and his streak of victories begins to attract both admiration and growing rage from the camp's leadership. Ito becomes increasingly obsessed with Wright when he recognizes that the techniques Wright is using are considered forbidden in traditional martial arts circles. This obsession turns into a complicated dynamic between captor and captive, one built on mutual recognition of each other's abilities even as Ito continues to punish and terrorize the other prisoners. Ito even begins executing members of his own troops who failed to defeat Wright in the ring, showing just how personal this rivalry has become for him. While the fights continue, Wright begins forming genuine bonds with the other prisoners around him. He connects most closely with an American officer named Captain Collins and a Filipino soldier named Sergeant Gabriel Villanueva. Collins brings a critical piece of information to Wright. Within 1 week, all prisoners in this camp will be transferred to a far worse facility, meaning any chance of survival depends on escaping before that transfer happens. Outside the walls of brutality, Wright also receives quiet, courageous help from a local Filipino nurse named Teresa, who has been forced to work at the camp and provides medical support to the prisoners. Together, this small group begins forming a daring escape plan, with the added goal of getting intelligence about Japanese troop movements out to Allied forces. Wright takes a bold risk and manages to steal a radio from inside the camp. He sneaks outside the perimeter at night and makes contact with American forces, successfully calling in reinforcements and learning that air raids will be coming. He brings this information back to Collins and Villanueva, and the three of them decide to use the chaos of the upcoming Allied bombing as the cover they need to break out. The plan begins to fall into place, but the situation inside the camp deteriorates faster than expected. As Ito orders the execution of more and more prisoners for no reason other than pure brutality, the three men realize they cannot wait any longer. During one of their secret missions to prepare for the escape, Collins kills a Japanese guard who discovers them. The next day, Collins is publicly executed for it. The loss hits Wright deeply, but it also removes any remaining hesitation. When Allied aircraft begin bombarding the camp, Wright, Teresa, and Villanueva make their move. In the chaos and fire of the air raids, Wright confronts Ito directly in a final one-on-one fight. Wright defeats him. And in one of the film's most compelling moments, Ito, out of a deep and genuine respect for Wright as a fellow martial artist, orders his men to stand down and allows Wright and his group to escape with their lives. The film then jumps forward to 1950, years after the war has ended. Wright breaks into the Ito dojo in Japan and confronts Shunsuke Ito, the son of Benjiro Ito. Shunsuke reveals that his father passed away years earlier from illness. In a final exchange that closes the story with a kind of unexpected peace, Shunsuke asks Wright to demonstrate the forbidden technique that his father had become so obsessed with. Wright complies and defeats Shunsuke in a brief exchange. As a gesture of closure, Shunsuke returns to Wright a medallion that Benjiro Ito had stolen from him years ago inside the camp. The film ends there, not with explosions or chaos, but with a quiet act of respect between two men carrying the weight of a war that shaped them both. Cast. Now let us talk about the people who brought this story to life. The lead role of Wing Commander James Wright is played by Scott Adkins, a British actor who has spent decades establishing himself as one of the most technically gifted martial artists in the action film world. Adkins not only stars in the film but also developed the original story, which makes his performance here feel entirely invested from start to finish. He carries the weight of every scene, whether it is a brutal fight sequence or a quiet moment of grief inside the prison camp. Lieutenant Colonel Benjiro Ito, the film's primary antagonist and one of its most layered characters, is played by Peter Shinkoda. Shinkoda delivers a performance that avoids making Ito a simple one-dimensional villain. There is an intelligence and a complicated inner life to this character that makes him genuinely fascinating to watch. Captain Collins, the American officer who becomes Wright's closest ally inside the camp, is played by Donald Cerrone, the real-life professional MMA and UFC fighter also known by his nickname Cowboy. Michael Copon plays Sergeant Gabriel Villanueva, the Filipino soldier who becomes an essential part of the escape plan and brings genuine heart to his role. The character of Teresa, the Filipino nurse who quietly risks her life to help the prisoners, is played by Gabby Garcia, a well-known Filipino actress who brings warmth and courage to a role that could easily have been overlooked. The supporting cast includes Gary Cairns as Jonesy, Michael Renee Walton as the Beard, Masanori Mimoto as the brutal Captain Endo, Shane Kosugi as Corporal Hirano, Atsuki Kashio as Hiroshi, Kensuke Yokoi as Shunsuke Ito in the film's closing chapter, and Pauline Lopez as Anna. The overall ensemble is strong, and the combination of Western action talent with Filipino and Japanese performers gives the film a real sense of authenticity that many war films simply do not bother achieving. Release date and festival history. Principal photography on the film began during the last week of July 2024 and continued through late August 2024. The film was originally announced under the title Death March before being renamed Prisoner of War ahead of its public release. Prisoner of War had its world premiere on April 3, 2025, with a special screening at the iconic TCL Chinese Theater in Hollywood, hosted by the Beverly Hills Film Festival. It was then screened at the Big Bad Film Fest in Glendale, California on August 22, 2025, followed by another screening on August 30, 2025, at the California Railroad Museum in Sacramento, hosted by the Sacramento International Film Festival. Well, Go USA Entertainment then released the film on VOD and in limited theatrical engagements across the United States on September 19, 2025. For audiences in the United Kingdom, the film was released on DVD, Blu-ray, and digital formats on November 10, 2025, through Kaleidoscope Home Entertainment. Trailer and critical reception. The film received 2 official trailers, with the second trailer being added in late July 2025, building significant anticipation among action film fans ahead of the September release. The trailers showcased the film's unique combination of World War II historical drama and raw hand-to-hand combat, which immediately caught attention online. Critical reception was mixed to positive overall. Reviewers widely praised Scott Adkins' performance and the quality of the fight choreography, calling it some of the finest work of his career. Critics at RogerEbert.com described the film as a genuine showcase for Adkins' action prowess and highlighted the intensity he brings to every physical sequence. On the other hand, some reviewers pointed out that the narrative depth outside of Wright's personal journey was somewhat thin, and that several of the supporting characters were not developed as fully as they could have been. The general consensus settled on the film being a raw, visceral, and genuinely unique entry in both the war film and martial arts genres, one that stands apart simply because nothing quite like it has been made before. A World War II prison escape film built around a martial arts tournament format is not something that existed before this, and that originality alone earns the film real respect. The IMDb rating settled at 5.7 out of 10, which is somewhat low but does not fully reflect the enthusiasm that action film fans specifically have shown for the movie. Among that audience, the film has been consistently praised and recommended as one of the best action films Scott Adkins has delivered in recent years. Prisoner of War, 2025, complete story breakdown in full detail. The world before the storm. To truly understand the story of Prisoner of War, you first need to understand the world it is set in. The year is 1942. The Second World War is raging across every corner of the globe, and in the Pacific, Japan has expanded its military dominance with terrifying speed and force. The Philippines, a strategically vital archipelago in Southeast Asia, has fallen under Japanese occupation. The Battle of Bataan is underway, one of the bloodiest and most desperate engagements of the entire Pacific War, as Allied forces fight to hold their ground against a Japanese military that is better supplied, better positioned, and relentless in its advance. It is in the middle of this chaos that we meet our central character. Wing Commander James Wright is a Royal Air Force officer serving with the British military. He is not a simple soldier. He is a highly trained, highly disciplined man who spent significant time in Hong Kong before the war, where he immersed himself deeply in the study of martial arts. He did not just learn techniques. He studied under a master, absorbed the philosophy behind the fighting styles, and developed a method of combat that draws from traditions considered rare, even forbidden, in the broader martial arts world. This history is not presented as a backstory detail to be forgotten. It becomes the very engine of everything that happens to him once he is captured. Wright carries his training with him not as a trophy but as a tool for survival, and when survival becomes the only thing that matters, that training is what keeps him alive. Wright is on a combat mission flying over the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines. His aircraft is struck and goes down. The plane crashes, and by some measure of fate or sheer physical toughness, Wright survives the wreckage. He pulls himself out and tries to move, tries to find a way back to Allied lines, but the jungle and the enemy are everywhere. Japanese forces close in on him quickly, and before he can mount any meaningful resistance or escape, he is captured and taken prisoner. Inside the camp, Wright is transported to a Japanese prisoner of war camp somewhere in the Philippine jungle. The moment he enters, the full horror of what this place is becomes immediately clear. This is not a place of confinement designed to hold men until the war ends. This is a place designed to break men, physically, psychologically, and spiritually. The camp is run by Lieutenant Colonel Benjiro Ito, a Japanese officer of significant rank and considerable intelligence. Ito is not a screaming, cartoonish villain. He is cold, composed, and deeply authoritative. He runs his camp with the belief that the prisoners beneath him represent not just enemy soldiers but symbols of Western civilization that must be humiliated and crushed. His cruelty is not random. It is purposeful and ideological. Under Ito's command, the prisoners are subjected to forced labor every single day. They carry heavy loads, build structures for their captors, and work until their bodies give out. The food provided to them is deliberately insufficient. Starvation is used as a method of control. Men who are too weak to resist cannot fight back, and Ito understands this perfectly. Physical punishment is handed out for the smallest infractions. Executions are carried out publicly, in front of the other prisoners, to ensure that the message of absolute powerlessness is never forgotten. The camp is a machine designed to destroy human dignity, and it operates efficiently. The other Allied prisoners inside the camp come from different backgrounds and nationalities. They are Americans, Filipinos, and various Allied soldiers who were captured during the fighting across the Philippines. They have been in this camp long enough to understand its rules, its rhythms, and its dangers. Some of them have found small ways to maintain their sense of self. Others have been ground down into a state of resigned despair. When Wright arrives, he is a new face in a world that has long since lost faith in rescue, relief, or escape. The first confrontation. Wright's introduction to the camp immediately sets him apart from the other prisoners. Ito's right-hand enforcer, Captain Hirano, is ordered to deal with the new British prisoner in the most direct way possible. He is ordered to execute Wright. This kind of immediate execution of new prisoners was not unusual in this environment. It sends a message to the existing prisoners and eliminates anyone who might prove to be a problem before they have a chance to become one. But James Wright is not the kind of man who simply accepts what is happening to him. When Hirano moves to carry out the execution, Wright acts. In a sudden, explosive, and extraordinarily precise burst of combat, he kills Hirano and then takes down 2 additional Japanese soldiers who move to stop him. It happens fast, and it stuns everyone who witnesses it, both the prisoners and the guards. Wright then attempts to flee the camp entirely, using the confusion of the moment to make a run for the perimeter. He does not make it far. He is quickly recaptured and dragged back into the camp. By any reasonable measure, This failed escape attempt should have resulted in his immediate death. A prisoner who has just killed 3 soldiers, including a senior officer, has signed his own death warrant. But something unexpected happens. Ito, who was informed of what Wright did, does not order his execution. Instead, he becomes intrigued. The speed, the technique, the effectiveness with which this British officer killed 3 trained soldiers with his bare hands, this is not something Ito has seen before. He recognizes that there is something unusual about this man, and that recognition saves Wright's life, at least for the moment. The underground fights. Wright settles into the brutal daily routine of the camp while carrying the awareness that his life is on a razor's edge. It is during this period that he discovers one of the camp's darkest open secrets. The Japanese officers who run the camp have organized a series of underground fighting matches. These are not sanctioned military events. They are brutal, forced gladiatorial contests in which prisoners are compelled to fight, either against each other or against Japanese soldiers chosen by the camp leadership. The purpose is entertainment for the officers and guards, and also a means of demonstrating Japanese physical and cultural superiority over the Allied prisoners. Participation is not optional. Prisoners who refuse to fight are simply taken out and executed. The message is perfectly clear: you fight or you die. And if you fight and you lose, depending on the mood of whoever is watching, that might also mean you die. These matches are organized with a kind of ceremony and ritual that makes them feel all the more dehumanizing. The prisoners are not seen as men. They are sport. Wright watches these fights. He sees what happens to those who resist. He sees the executions. He understands the mathematics of his situation with perfect clarity. His options are limited, and the best available option is to fight. When he is eventually pressured into participating, he steps forward. What happens next changes the atmosphere of the entire camp. Wright fights the way he has always fought, using the techniques he absorbed during his years of training in Hong Kong, drawing on principles and methods that are far outside what the Japanese soldiers have been trained to expect or counter. He is not just strong or fast. He is technically superior in a way that is almost shocking to witness. He moves through his opponents with a combination of precision, timing, and controlled force that dismantles their attacks before they can land. He defeats the best martial artist in the camp, a man named Koji, in a contest that leaves everyone watching, guards and prisoners alike, in a state of stunned silence. His victories continue. Fight after fight, Wright walks out of those underground matches having beaten whoever was put in front of him. This begins to shift something inside the camp. The prisoners who have been watching start to feel something they had almost entirely forgotten: hope. Here is a man who is not broken. Here is a man who fights back and wins. That is an enormously powerful thing to witness when you are living in a place specifically designed to make you feel powerless. Ito's obsession. Wright's winning streak does not go unnoticed at the top. Ito watches with growing complexity. Part of him is infuriated. His men are being defeated by a prisoner, and that humiliation strikes at the ideological heart of everything Ito believes about Japanese superiority. He begins executing members of his own troops, soldiers who failed to beat Wright in the ring, as punishment for their failures. This tells you everything about the kind of man Ito is. He punishes his own people for losing, which creates an environment of terror not just for the prisoners but for the guards themselves. But alongside the rage, there is something else building in Ito. He is genuinely fascinated by Wright's technique. As a man who has devoted his own life to the study and practice of martial arts, Ito begins to identify specific elements in Wright's fighting style that he recognizes as belonging to a tradition that is considered forbidden in the martial arts world. These are techniques that have been suppressed and hidden, passed down only through very specific lineages of teachers. The fact that Wright knows them means Wright was trained by someone extraordinary, someone whose identity Ito becomes deeply interested in uncovering. This obsession creates a strange, tense dynamic between captor and captive. Ito does not respect Wright the way one human being respects another. But he recognizes Wright as a martial artist with genuine mastery, and that recognition operates on a separate level from everything else. It is the only thing keeping Wright alive at this point. Ito wants to understand him before he destroys him. And Wright, for his part, is fully aware of how thin that thread of safety truly is. Captain Endo, Ito's other senior enforcer in the camp, does not share his commander's complicated fascination with Wright. Endo is straightforwardly brutal and wants Wright dealt with through simple violence. The tension between Ito's obsession and Endo's hostility creates a dangerous environment that Wright must navigate carefully every single day. Bonds formed in darkness. While all of this is unfolding, Wright is not surviving alone. During the work details and the quiet moments between the horrors, he begins forming genuine human connections with his fellow prisoners. These relationships become the emotional core of the film's second act and give Wright something beyond personal survival to fight for. The most important of these connections is with Captain Collins, an American officer who has been in the camp long enough to understand its every corner and weakness. Collins is a physically powerful man, broad and strong, and he carries himself with the kind of stubborn resilience that has kept him alive when many others around him have not made it. Collins brings Wright a piece of critical intelligence that changes the entire shape of their situation. He tells Wright that within 1 week, all prisoners currently in this camp will be transferred to a different facility, one that, by all accounts Collins has gathered, is significantly worse than where they are now. Whatever chance they have of surviving this war depends on escaping before that transfer happens. After that, the odds become nearly impossible. Wright also builds a bond with Sergeant Gabriel Villanueva, a Filipino soldier whose knowledge of the local terrain and whose fierce determination make him an essential part of any escape plan. Villanueva represents the Filipino people caught in the middle of a war being fought across their own homeland, and his personal stake in getting out of the camp runs just as deep as Wright's. Outside the direct prisoner community, Wright receives quiet and courageous assistance from Teresa, a young Filipino nurse who has been forced by the Japanese to provide medical services at the camp. Teresa takes enormous personal risks to provide the prisoners with medical care that goes beyond what her captors intend, and she becomes a crucial part of the support structure that keeps Wright and others alive and functional enough to plan. Her involvement in the escape plan is not peripheral. She is a full participant who understands the risks completely and chooses to accept them. The escape plan takes shape. With the deadline of the prisoner transfer pressing down on all of them, Wright, Collins, and Villanueva begin working out the details of how to get out. The plan is not just about escaping the camp itself. Wright wants to carry intelligence about Japanese troop movements and positions out to Allied forces, which would make their escape strategically valuable beyond just their personal survival. To make any of this possible, Wright decides to take a risk that could get him killed immediately if discovered. He manages to locate and steal a radio from within the camp, a device that the Japanese have and the prisoners are obviously forbidden from touching. In the dead of night, Wright sneaks outside the main perimeter of the camp and uses the stolen radio to make contact with American forces. The communication is successful. He transmits what intelligence he has and learns that Allied air raids are being planned and will be coming. This is the window they need. When the bombs start falling and chaos erupts across the camp, that is the moment to move. Wright returns to Collins and Villanueva with the news. The three of them agree that they will use the air raids as their cover and execute the escape the moment the bombing begins. While preparing for this, they conduct a covert nighttime reconnaissance outside the camp walls to inspect a downed glider that they have identified as a potential means of getting further away once they are out. The inspection goes wrong when Collins is forced to kill a Japanese guard who discovers them in the darkness. They return to the camp, but the damage is done. The dead guard is discovered, and the next morning Collins is publicly executed as punishment, taken out in front of the entire camp population and killed. The loss of Collins is devastating. He was Wright's most reliable ally, the one who had brought him into the plan in the first place and provided much of the structural thinking behind it. But his death also removes the last trace of hesitation from Wright. There is nothing left to wait for. Everything must happen now. The escape and the final fight. When the Allied air raids begin and the first bombs start falling across the camp, everything descends into noise, fire, and confusion. This is the moment Wright has been waiting for. He moves quickly, gathering Teresa and Villanueva and pushing toward the exit as the camp erupts into chaos around them. But escape is never that simple. Wright and Ito find each other in the chaos. The final confrontation between these two men, the British martial arts master and the Japanese lieutenant colonel who has been obsessed with him, happens here, in the middle of the burning camp, surrounded by noise and destruction. This fight is not just physical. It carries everything that has built between them: the months of captivity, the underground matches, the executions, the stolen medallion, the obsession, and the strange, complicated respect that has grown between two men who are fundamentally enemies. Wright wins the fight. He defeats Ito decisively. And then something remarkable happens. Ito, lying defeated, looks at Wright and makes a choice. He orders his surrounding soldiers to stand down. He tells them not to pursue. He lets Wright go. Not out of weakness, and not because he has suddenly become a good man. He does it because, as a martial artist who has spent his entire life inside a code of honor built around the recognition of genuine mastery, he cannot bring himself to destroy what he has come to recognize as a true master. It is a strange, morally complicated moment, a man who has ordered the deaths of countless prisoners extending a final act of warrior's respect to the one prisoner he could never break. Wright, Teresa, and Villanueva escape the camp and make it out into the Filipino jungle as the air raids continue behind them. The epilogue, 1950. The film does not end with the escape. It jumps forward 8 years to 1950, 5 years after the end of the Second World War. The world has changed. Japan has been defeated. The occupation of the Philippines is a memory, though a deeply scarred one. And James Wright has been carrying something unresolved inside him for all of those years, the medallion that Benjiro Ito stole from him inside the camp. A personal possession, taken as an act of domination, and never returned. Wright travels to Japan and breaks into the Ito dojo. He finds Shunsuke Ito, the son of Benjiro Ito, now running the dojo in his father's name. Wright confronts him, asking directly about his father. Shunsuke tells him that Benjiro Ito died years ago from illness, not in battle, not as a warrior, but quietly, from sickness. There is something in that detail that is quietly significant. The man who commanded a prison camp with absolute brutality did not get a warrior's death. He simply got sick and died. Shunsuke, having heard of Wright, perhaps from stories his father told, perhaps from the reputation that followed Wright's time in the camp, asks Wright to demonstrate the forbidden technique that his father had become so consumed with understanding. Wright accepts. The two of them fight briefly, and Wright wins. Shunsuke, in a final gesture that closes the entire story with an unexpected sense of peace, takes out the medallion that his father had kept all those years and returns it to Wright. No grand speech accompanies this moment. No dramatic declaration. Just the return of an object that was taken, passed back across a generational divide between former enemies. Wright takes the medallion, and the film ends. Complete life histories of the cast of Prisoner of War, 2025. Scott Adkins, James Wright. Scott Edward Adkins was born on June 17, 1976, in Sutton Coldfield, a town within the Birmingham metropolitan area of the West Midlands in England. He came from a family with a deeply working-class and traditional background. For generations, his family had been butchers, and that trade was the world his father and the men before him had known. Scott grew up in a middle-class household with his parents, John and Janet Adkins, and his older brother Craig. The expectations that surrounded him were ordinary and practical, the kind of expectations that most families in similar circumstances carry: finish school, find steady work, build a sensible life. Scott Adkins would go on to do the exact opposite of everything sensible, and in doing so, he would build one of the most remarkable careers in the action film world. As a child, Scott was a natural athlete who loved sport in any form. He played whatever was available and developed a physical restlessness that academic life simply could not satisfy. He was, by his own admission, not a particularly dedicated student at Bishop Vesey's grammar school in Sutton Coldfield. He would sneak downstairs after his parents went to bed and watch films all night: Hollywood films, action films, martial arts films, and then fall asleep during class the next day. Those late-night film sessions were not just entertainment. They were the beginning of two obsessions that would define his entire life: martial arts and cinema. When Scott was 10 years old, his father took him and his older brother Craig to the local judo club. The moment Scott walked in and felt what that environment was, something locked into place inside him. The attraction was immediate and total. He threw himself into judo with a commitment that went far beyond what a 10-year-old is usually capable of sustaining. He idolized Bruce Lee and Jean-Claude Van Damme with the kind of total devotion that only a child can manage, and he set up a personal training space in his father's garage, turning it into a makeshift dojo, complete with a shrine to Bruce Lee that he would bow to before training. That detail says everything about who Scott Adkins was becoming. At 13, Scott was robbed. The experience shook him but also deepened his commitment to martial arts, transforming what had been a passion into something closer to a personal code. At 14, he began training in Taekwondo under a coach named Ron Sergi, and his progression through that discipline was rapid and serious. He earned his black belt in Taekwondo at 19, a significant achievement that validated years of daily discipline and sacrifice. At 16, he began adding kickboxing to his training under coach Anthony Jones, eventually reaching the level of fully certified kickboxing instructor for the Professional Karate Association. He ran classes once a week at a gym in Bearwood, Smethwick, while continuing to train himself. Over the years that followed, Scott Adkins would go on to train in an extraordinary range of martial arts disciplines, building what became one of the most comprehensive martial arts skill sets of any working actor in the world. His training includes judo, taekwondo, kickboxing, karate, ninjutsu, capoeira, krav maga, wushu, muay thai, various styles of kung fu, jeet kune do, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and acrobatic gymnastics. He does not simply understand these disciplines on a surface level. He has spent decades developing genuine competence and depth in each of them, and that shows clearly in every single fight sequence he has ever filmed. Alongside martial arts, Scott developed a growing love for acting. He enrolled in drama classes at Sutton Coldfield College, though he found the social dimension of it, standing up in front of people, being vulnerable and expressive, far more difficult than anything he faced in the dojo. Being a naturally shy young man, performing on a stage required a completely different kind of courage from him. But he persisted, and eventually, at the age of 21, he was offered a place at the Webber Douglas Academy of Dramatic Art in London, one of the most prestigious drama schools in the United Kingdom. The opportunity was everything he had been working toward. But life intervened. As an impoverished student with no grant available to him, Scott simply could not afford to stay. He was forced to leave the academy before completing the course, and by his own description, he was devastated. He felt that the door had closed on acting, and that the path he had wanted was no longer available to him. But fate had other ideas. His first real break came when he was spotted and offered a role in a Hong Kong martial arts film called Extreme Challenge in 2001. He was identified by the head of the Hong Kong Stuntmen Association and by Bay Logan, a British martial arts film expert based in Hong Kong, and that connection opened a door that led him directly into the world he had dreamed of as a child watching films in the dark. His early work was primarily in Hong Kong productions, and he appeared in small supporting and stunt roles in films including The Accidental Spy and The Medallion alongside Jackie Chan. These were not lead roles, and the pay was not impressive, but every day he spent on those sets was education. He was learning how to work in front of a camera, how to perform martial arts choreography for film, and how to translate everything he had trained for his entire life into the specific demands of cinema. His profile began to grow through small roles in Western productions as well. He appeared in British television dramas including the long-running medical series Holby City and the drama Dangerfield. He took roles in whatever came his way, building his resume and his screen presence incrementally. His first significant breakthrough in the mainstream Western action market came with his role in The Bourne Ultimatum in 2007, where he played a highly skilled assassin engaged in a brutal corridor fight scene. That scene was short but explosive, and it introduced Scott Adkins to a global audience that had not previously known his name. His technical ability in that sequence was unmistakably real, and it set him apart from the actors around him. But the role that truly made Scott Adkins a cult icon in the action world was Yuri Boyka, the Russian prison fighter he first played in Undisputed 2, Last Man Standing in 2006. Boyka was a character unlike any other in modern action cinema. Technically brilliant, psychologically complex, physically intimidating, and yet carrying a deep vein of personal tragedy and spiritual searching underneath all the violence. Adkins brought all of that to life with a performance that went far beyond what the budget or the genre setting would have suggested possible. He reprised the role in Undisputed 3, Redemption in 2010 and again in Boyka, Undisputed in 2017, and across those three films, the character became one of the most beloved figures in the entire martial arts action genre. Fans around the world, many of whom had never encountered action cinema of that kind before, discovered Scott Adkins through Boyka and followed his career from that point forward with fierce loyalty. He continued building an impressive body of work through the following decade. He starred in the Ninja franchise, playing Casey Bowman across 2 films. He appeared alongside his lifelong idol Jean-Claude Van Damme in 4 films: The Shepherd, Border Patrol, Assassination Games, Universal Soldier, Day of Reckoning, and The Expendables 2. He took on the villain role in Ip Man 4, the finale opposite Donnie Yen, playing the antagonist with a controlled menace that made for compelling viewing. He appeared in Zero Dark 30 in 2012 and stepped into the Marvel Cinematic Universe with a role in Doctor Strange in 2016. In 2023, he appeared alongside Keanu Reeves in John Wick, Chapter 4, one of the most successful action films of recent years. In 2022, he starred in Day Shift alongside Jamie Foxx and Dave Franco, continuing to demonstrate that he belongs in major studio productions alongside the biggest names in Hollywood. Throughout all of this, he has never stopped training, never stopped pushing his physical and creative limits, and never stopped believing that authentic martial arts cinema deserves the same respect as any other form of filmmaking. Prisoner of War represents something even more personal than all of it. This is the film where Scott Adkins did not just star, he originated the story. The character of James Wright, the British officer who survives captivity through the power of martial arts training and human connection, is a concept that came from Adkins himself. He is married to Lisa Adkins, and they have 2 children. He is 49 years old, and he is still performing at a level that most action stars half his age cannot match. Peter Shinkota, Lieutenant Colonel Benjiro Ito. Peter Shinkota was born on March 25, 1971, in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. He and his brother Michael were raised in Montreal, a bilingual city with a rich cultural life, and from an early age Peter was drawn to 2 things that seemed to pull in opposite directions: high achievement in multiple disciplines and a deep, burning desire to work in entertainment. His family, like so many families of immigrant background in Canada, encouraged him toward stability. Engineering, medicine, these were the paths that made practical sense. But Peter Shinkoda was not interested in the practical path. His very first attempt at getting into the entertainment world came at a remarkably young age. When Steven Spielberg's Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom was casting in the early 1980s, an international casting call was held for the role of Short Round, the young Asian sidekick to Indiana Jones. Young Peter Shinkoda was so determined to audition that he forced his parents to drive 6 hours from Montreal to Toronto just so he could try. He did not get the part. The role ultimately went to Kahui Kwan, but the fact that a young child was willing to fight that hard for the opportunity tells you everything about the kind of drive that would carry Peter Shinkoda through his career. After that early disappointment, Shinkoda poured his energy into sports and academics. He became a genuinely exceptional multi-sport athlete, excelling at hockey, skiing, football, baseball, soccer, and judo. Canada is a country built around hockey, and Shinkoda took to it naturally, demonstrating the same physical aptitude that would later serve him in action-oriented roles. But alongside sports, he also developed a remarkable musical ability. By the time he was 13 years old, he had been identified as one of the top young classical pianists in all of Canada. This combination of physical excellence and musical sophistication speaks to a person of unusual depth and range. At 18, Shinkoda left Montreal and moved to Toronto to stay with relatives, testing his independence and exploring his options. After a year in Toronto, he enrolled at the University of Western Ontario to pursue a degree in civil engineering, the practical path his family had always hoped for. He completed 2 years of that program before the pull of entertainment became too strong to ignore any longer. He left engineering behind, a decision that took real courage given how much expectation surrounded that path, and committed himself to the entertainment industry. He made his way to Los Angeles and began the difficult and often demoralizing process of building an acting career. Before he could fully dedicate himself to acting, he worked at the Warner Brothers Studios facility in Burbank, starting as a production assistant and gradually working his way up through the studio's post-production department. He taught himself editing, eventually becoming an apprentice editor and then an assistant editor. He continued his education by studying post-production for film and television at UCLA and completing the Avid editing program at Video Symphony in North Hollywood. This technical education gave him an understanding of filmmaking from the inside that most actors never develop, and it made him a more informed and collaborative presence on set throughout his career. His first film credit came in 1991 with a role in If Looks Could Kill alongside Richard Grieco, and from there he steadily accumulated credits across both film and television. In the early 2000s, he appeared in a wave of significant productions. He had roles in Paycheck in 2003, the Will Smith blockbuster I, Robot in 2004, and the celebrated hockey film Miracle in 2004 alongside Kurt Russell. He appeared in Man About Town with Ben Affleck in 2006, and in War with Jet Li in 2007. He began building a strong television presence as well, appearing in Stargate SG-1, Dark Angel, The Dead Zone, Stephen King's Kingdom Hospital, The L Word, Supernatural, and many others. The role that gave him his greatest mainstream visibility was Die in Steven Spielberg's TNT science fiction series Falling Skies, which ran from 2011 to 2015. Being directed by Spielberg, the same director whose film he had tried to audition for as a child in Montreal, was a full-circle moment that Shinkoda has spoken about with obvious significance. He also appeared as Nobu, a significant recurring villain in Marvel's Daredevil on Netflix, a role that introduced him to an enormous global audience who followed Marvel's street-level superhero universe closely. His portrayal of Nobu was cold, precise, and deeply threatening, qualities he would bring again to his portrayal of Lieutenant Colonel Ito in Prisoner of War. Peter Shinkoda has spoken publicly and passionately about the importance of authentic Asian representation in Hollywood, a subject he has been willing to address directly at a time when the industry has been reckoning with its long history of sidelining Asian actors. His work in Prisoner of War, where he plays not a cartoonish villain but a complex, intelligent, and morally layered antagonist, represents exactly the kind of nuanced Asian representation he has advocated for. Donald Cerrone, Captain Collins. Donald Anthony Cerrone was born on March 29, 1983, in Denver, Colorado, into a life that would eventually be defined by combat, extreme sport, and a willingness to accept any challenge that was placed in front of him. Known throughout the world of mixed martial arts by his nickname Cowboy, a name that reflects both his personal style and his roots in the American West, Cerrone's life story is one of the most dramatic and compelling in sports history. His early years were not easy. Cerrone was a wild and difficult young man who struggled to contain his energy and aggression within the boundaries of normal life. He was frequently involved in street fights and found himself spending nights in jail. His behavior became too much for his parents to manage, and when he was 16 years old, they sent him to live with his grandmother. That change in environment turned out to be important. His grandmother provided a different kind of stability, and it was during this period that Cerrone found the structured outlet his nature had always been demanding. He attended Air Academy High School in Colorado Springs, where he discovered bull riding, one of the most physically dangerous activities a human being can voluntarily undertake. This was his first real encounter with extreme sport, and the combination of danger, skill, and raw nerve that bull riding demands appealed to exactly the part of him that had always been drawn toward conflict and physical challenge. During his sophomore year, he discovered kickboxing, and the switch was almost immediate. Cerrone took to kickboxing with an intensity that produced results almost immediately. As an amateur, he compiled a record of 13 wins and 0 losses. Not a loss in 13 amateur fights. That kind of dominance at the beginning of a combat sports career does not happen by accident. It happens when someone with extraordinary natural ability also commits themselves to genuine, serious training. After his amateur kickboxing run, Cerrone transitioned to professional Muay Thai, and his record there was even more extraordinary. He went 28 wins and 0 losses in professional Muay Thai competition, with 18 of those victories coming by first-round knockout. He won 4 kickboxing championships during this period. The combination of power, timing, and tactical intelligence that he demonstrated in those fights made it obvious that he was not just a talented fighter, he was something exceptional. In 2006, Cerrone transitioned to mixed martial arts, beginning his career at a gym called Freedom Fighters in Commerce City, Colorado. He quickly attracted serious attention and began training at Greg Jackson's world-famous submission fighting school in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where he trained alongside fighters who would become some of the biggest names in MMA history, including John Jones, Rashad Evans, Nathan Marquardt, Georges St. Pierre, and others. Being in that environment every day, competing against and learning from athletes of that caliber, accelerated his development enormously. He fought his way through regional competition and into the World Extreme Cage Fighting Organization, the WEC, where he became one of the most exciting lightweight fighters in the world. His WEC performances established his reputation as a fighter who would take on anyone, accept fights on short notice, and always show up ready to perform at the highest level. He accumulated 5 Fight of the Night honors during his WEC career alone. When the UFC absorbed the WEC in 2010, Cerrone transitioned into the biggest mixed martial arts organization in the world, and he became one of its most productive and beloved figures. He made his UFC debut in February 2011 at UFC 126, submitting Paul Kelly in the second round, and both fighters earned Fight of the Night bonus for that performance. It was a statement arrival. From that point forward, Cerrone went on to become statistically one of the most accomplished fighters in UFC history. He holds the record for the most wins in the organization, 23 UFC victories, a record he shares with Andrei Arlovski. he holds the record for most finishes. He holds the record for most knockdowns in UFC history with 20. He participated in more fights under the Zuffa banner, which includes the UFC, Pride, Strike Force, and WEC, than anyone else in history at 48 total bouts. His list of victories over elite opponents reads like a Hall of Fame highlight reel: Anthony Pettis, Edson Barboza, Miles Jury, Al Iaquinta, Jim Miller the first time, and many others. He fought for the UFC lightweight championship against Rafael dos Anjos in December 2015 in one of the most anticipated fights of that year, losing in the first round but continuing to compete and grow. ESPN named him Best Fighter of the Half Year in 2015. He won the Breakthrough Fighter of the Year award from the World MMA Awards in 2011. He earned the Fight of the Year honors from Sports Illustrated in 2009 and from the Sherdog Awards in both 2008 and 2009. He retired from MMA competition in 2022, following a second-round submission loss to Jim Miller at UFC 276. He finished his career with a professional record of 36 wins and 17 losses, a record built over more than 16 years of professional competition at the highest level of the sport. Following his retirement, the UFC inducted him into the UFC Hall of Fame, recognizing his contributions to the organization and to the sport as a whole. His personal life includes a son named Daxon Danger Cerrone, born to his longtime partner Lindsay Sheffield. Cerrone's transition into acting, including his role as Captain Collins in Prisoner of War, is a natural extension of the public personality he developed during his fighting career, someone defined by toughness, loyalty, and a willingness to put himself in the middle of difficult situations and see them through. Michael Copon, Sergeant Gabriel Villanueva. Michael Copon was born on November 13, 1982, in Chesapeake, Virginia, and he carries within him a personal story of cultural identity that shaped both who he became and the kinds of roles that have defined his career. His father, Berlin Copon, is of Filipino descent, and his mother, Monica Zelasco, has German, English, and Scottish ancestry. Growing up in a household where those two very different cultural worlds existed side by side gave Michael a sense of dual identity that he has spoken about as a source of both pride and complexity. His Filipino heritage in particular would become increasingly important to him as he grew older and began to understand the significance of representation in American entertainment. Michael grew up in Chesapeake, Virginia, and attended Deep Creek High School, where he was active in sports and extracurricular activities and carried himself with the natural confidence and physical presence that would eventually catch the attention of casting directors and talent scouts. He graduated in 2000 and, with relatively little delay, began making his way toward the entertainment industry. He moved to Los Angeles and began working as a print model, using his striking looks and physical presence to get his foot inside the door of an industry that is notoriously difficult to break into without either connections or a lucky break. The lucky break arrived in 2001, less than a year after his high school graduation, when Fox Kids Network was holding auditions for a new installment of one of the most beloved children's action franchises in American television history, Power Rangers. The role being cast was Lucas Kendall, the Blue Time Force Ranger in Power Rangers Time Force. The audition process was competitive and extensive, with a large pool of candidates being considered for the role. Michael Copon stood out. He was cast as the Blue Ranger and became one of the series' leads, stepping into a franchise that had millions of devoted young fans around the world. For a young actor barely out of high school, it was a remarkable debut, instantly recognizable, nationally broadcast, and associated with a brand that children adored. He even reprised his role in Power Rangers Wild Force in a crossover episode, cementing his connection to the franchise. From Power Rangers, he made a natural transition into the world of teen drama. He landed a recurring role as Felix Tagaro in One Tree Hill during its second season, a show that was at the center of American teen television culture in the mid-2000s. The role gave him exposure to an audience that was older and more diverse than the Power Rangers viewership, and it demonstrated that he could hold his own in a drama-driven environment rather than just an action-oriented one. Other television appearances followed steadily. He appeared in Scrubs, That's So Raven, Hawaii 5-0, Reno 911, and the beach drama series Beyond the Break, in which he starred as the lead character Vin Keahi from 2006 to 2009. On the film side, Copan built up a roster of credits in the action and genre spaces. He appeared in Bring It On, In It to Win It in 2007, and took on the starring role of Matthias in The Scorpion King, Rise of a Warrior in 2008, a direct-to-video sequel that placed him in a physically demanding role that required real commitment to training and performance. He has appeared in a series of horror films including Night of the Demons, Killer Holiday, and 247 Degrees Fahrenheit. His range extends beyond performing. He has worked as a producer and even served as a stunt coordinator on several of his productions, a level of behind-the-scenes involvement that demonstrates a genuine passion for filmmaking beyond just his own on-screen work. One notable near miss in his career came during the casting of the Twilight Saga, New Moon, where Copan was seriously considered for the role of Jacob Black. That role ultimately went to Taylor Lautner and became one of the most iconic teen franchise roles of the late 2000s. The fact that Copan was in contention for it speaks to how highly he was regarded at that stage of his career. Beyond acting, Copan has also demonstrated real musical talent. He appeared on the VH1 competition series But Can They Sing?, a show that challenged celebrities without musical backgrounds to perform, and he won the competition, releasing a single called Let's Get Nasty on iTunes in 2010. In more recent years, Copan has channeled significant energy into production work and into supporting the connection between Hollywood and the Virginia filmmaking community. He has been involved in building Copan Studios with the aim of developing Virginia Beach into a real hub for film production, a vision that speaks to his desire to create opportunities in the place he comes from rather than simply extracting himself from it to chase success elsewhere. His Filipino heritage has also become a more central part of his public identity, as the years have passed and the conversation around Asian representation in Hollywood has grown louder and more meaningful. His role as Sergeant Villanueva in Prisoner of War, a Filipino soldier fighting for survival in his own homeland, carries a personal resonance for Copan that goes far beyond just playing a part. Gabby Garcia, Teresa. Gabby Garcia was born Gabriela Luis Ortega Lopez on December 2, 1998, in Makati, one of the most densely urban and commercially active cities within Metro Manila in the Philippines. She grew up in a middle-class family. Her father, Vince Pena Lopez, worked as a security manager, and her mother, Tez Lopez, was a flight attendant. She is the second child in her family and has an older sister named Alexandra. The family's ancestral home was in the nearby city of Pasay, and it was there that much of her childhood was spent. From a very early age, Gabby Garcia was drawn to performance and competition in equal measure. She developed an interest in beauty pageants as a young girl, watching them on television, being fascinated by the combination of beauty, poise, and public performance they demanded, and she began competing in them as she grew older. She won the Ms. Skin White title in 2011 and the Ms. Solane title in 2013, both victories that built her confidence and put her in front of audiences before she had ever stepped onto a film or television set. At the age of 10, she became a licensed scuba diver, a detail that speaks to the adventurous and physically curious nature that would carry through her entire life. By the time she reached high school, she was also deeply involved in choir, dance, and the school's cheering squad, suggesting a person who was always most alive when performing. She completed her secondary education at St. Paul College Pasig, where she continued to develop the performing instincts that would eventually lead her to audition for a career in professional entertainment. In her teenage years, she also joined singing competitions and participated in local gigs with bands, trying every possible avenue that might lead toward the stage or screen. Her faith as a practicing Christian was and continues to be an important part of her personal life, providing a foundation of values and community that she has spoken about with genuine openness. The professional breakthrough came in 2014, when she auditioned for the GMA Network primetime series My Destiny and earned a supporting role as Nicole Perez. At that time, she was credited under the slightly different name Gabrielle Garcia. The series ran for 80 episodes and was well received both domestically and internationally, giving Gabby her first sustained professional experience in front of a television camera and introducing her to the world of Philippine broadcast entertainment. The exposure led to further work, and she was paired in a love team, a common structure in Filipino entertainment where two young actors are paired and branded together for romantic lead roles, with a fellow actor named Rura Madrid. Their partnership generated significant public interest and led to multiple collaborative projects over several years. The role that truly transformed Gabby Garcia from a promising newcomer into a genuine star was Sangiari Elena in the 2016 fantasy epic Encantadia, a GMA Network production that reimagined a beloved Filipino fantasy series for a new generation. The show was a massive production for Philippine television standards, featuring elaborate costumes, visual effects, and a world-building ambition that was unusual for the medium. Gabby's portrayal of Elena, one of the four elemental fairy sisters at the center of the story, became the defining role of her early career. The character required emotional range, physical grace, and the ability to carry both intimate dramatic scenes and large-scale action and fantasy sequences, and Gabby delivered on all of it. The show's success pushed her into the top tier of Filipino television actresses and established her as one of the most recognizable faces in GMA Network's roster. She went on to star in numerous subsequent productions including Instadad, Let the Love Begin, Sherlock Jr., Pamilya Rosas, Beautiful Justice, and others, building up a body of television work that spans drama, romance, fantasy, and action. Her love team with Rura Madrid came to a natural end in 2018 when her character in Sherlock Jr. unexpectedly died mid-series, and Gabby has been open since then about her preference for working with a variety of leading men rather than being locked into a single long-term screen partnership. Her real-life relationship with actor Khalil Ramos, which began in 2017 and continues to the present, has also brought its own layer of public interest and media attention. Beyond acting, Gabby Garcia has built a substantial social media presence, with over 10 million Instagram followers, more than 2.5 million Facebook followers, and a YouTube channel where she documents aspects of her life and work through vlogging. She is a global endorser for various brands and has worked as a host in addition to her acting commitments. She brings to Prisoner of War not only her acting ability but also the fact that she is one of the most well-known faces in the Philippines. For a film set in that country, and partially made by Filipino talent, her involvement carries a cultural weight that matters. The budget. How they made a $2 million film look far more expensive. One of the most extraordinary things about Prisoner of War 2025 is not what happens on screen. It is what happened before the cameras ever started rolling, specifically the question of money. The film was made on a production budget of just $2 million. $2 million. To put that number in perspective, many Hollywood studio productions spend more than that on a single day of catering and transportation alone. Major blockbuster films regularly operate on budgets of $100 million, $200 million, and even $300 million. Prisoner of War had $2 million to build a World War II prisoner of war camp in the Philippine jungle, dress actors in period-accurate 1940s military uniforms across multiple nationalities, source authentic-looking props including weapons, vehicles and equipment, choreograph and film 11 separate fight sequences, and tell a 2-hour story set across one of the most brutally documented periods of the entire 20th century. The fact that the finished film looks as convincing as it does is nothing short of a minor miracle of low-budget filmmaking, and it speaks to a series of decisions made by the creative team that were as smart as they were necessary. The single biggest and most consequential budget decision made on this film was the choice to shoot in the Philippines. That choice was not accidental and was not driven purely by historical authenticity, though the authenticity it provided was real and valuable. It was driven by economics. Scott Adkins himself acknowledged this directly in interviews promoting the film. He pointed out that shooting in the Philippines meant they could bring over authentic Japanese actors and martial artists from Japan at a fraction of what it would have cost to hire and fly those same actors to the United Kingdom or the United States for a domestic production. The cost of labor, locations, and logistics in the Philippines is dramatically lower than in Western countries, which meant that every dollar the production had went significantly further on the ground there than it would have elsewhere. The jungle environment of the Philippines also meant that the World War II Pacific theater setting was built into the landscape they were already working in. They did not need to manufacture that world from scratch. The trees, the heat, the dense foliage, the mud, the terrain, it was all already there, real and atmospheric and usable. The second major budget decision was the one that critics and viewers alike ended up praising even without knowing it was budget-driven: the choice to keep almost the entire film inside the walls of the prison camp. The story barely leaves the camp for the first 100 minutes. Almost everything happens within a roughly 1,000-foot radius of the prison camp set, the fighting ring at its center, and the immediately surrounding jungle area. Only the film's opening sequence and its 1950 epilogue take place outside that world. At the time of production, this felt like an artistic constraint. In retrospect, it turned out to be one of the most effective storytelling tools in the film, because keeping the camera locked inside the camp creates a suffocating sense of confinement and imprisonment that no amount of cinematographic trickery could manufacture from the outside. The production team turned a budget limitation into a narrative weapon, and audiences felt the claustrophobia without necessarily understanding why. The costumes were another area of careful management. Scott Adkins admitted in interviews that he was genuinely concerned before production began about whether the period costumes would look convincing or whether they would come across as cheap and unconvincing on screen. Sourcing accurate 1940s British Royal Air Force uniforms, Japanese military uniforms across multiple ranks, Filipino civilian and military clothing, and the ragged, deteriorating prisoner clothing for a group of actors playing men who had been in a camp for months. All of that has to look right, or the entire historical illusion collapses. The production team worked within its constraints and managed to produce costumes that reviewers consistently described as believable. They got away with it, as Adkins himself put it in his own words. The props, particularly the period weapons, were another concern Adkins flagged going into production. Authentic-looking World War II-era rifles, handguns, and military equipment had to be sourced, and within a $2 million budget that covered everything else simultaneously, every prop purchase had to count. The production leaned heavily on the Philippines' established film industry infrastructure, which had experience producing period productions and had existing networks of suppliers and rental houses that could provide what was needed at manageable cost. The cinematographer on the film, Nicolas de la Fère, was the same director of photography who had shot Adkins's other 2025 film, Diablo. Adkins praised de la Fère extensively in interviews, pointing out that despite being the same person behind the camera on both projects, the two films look completely different from each other, different color palettes, different textures, different visual moods. That kind of versatility from a cinematographer is enormously valuable on a low-budget production, because it means you do not need to hire additional specialists or rent additional equipment to achieve different visual results. De la Fère gave the film a gritty, warm, sweat-drenched visual texture that reviewers compared favorably to classic prisoner of war films of previous decades, and he did it all within the same modest budget envelope as everything else. The music score, composed by Tassis Eliopoulos, added another layer of cinematic weight to a film that could easily have felt thin without strong musical support. The score had to carry emotional moments that the limited budget could not support with elaborate visual effects or production design, and it delivered that support consistently across the film's 2-hour runtime. The end result of all these careful decisions was a film that grossed approximately $94 million worldwide in terms of total revenue across theatrical, VOD, and home entertainment channels, a return that dwarfs the original $2 million investment many times over. Multiple viewers on review platforms specifically called out the gap between what the film cost and what it looked like on screen, noting that it looked like a significantly more expensive production than it actually was. That is the highest compliment you can pay to a low-budget filmmaking team, and it is a compliment this team fully earned. Funny and memorable behind-the-scenes moments. Now for the part that nobody talks about in the reviews, what actually happened on set when the cameras stopped rolling, and the amusing, chaotic, and genuinely human moments that came out of making a very serious war film under very challenging conditions. The first and perhaps the funniest story from production, and Scott Adkins told this one himself in multiple interviews with a level of self-deprecating humor that made it instantly endearing, is what happened on day one of principal photography. Day 1. The very first day of shooting. Scott Adkins, the man who has spent his entire adult life training in over a dozen martial arts disciplines, who performs his own stunts, who has sustained a career built entirely on physical excellence and athletic precision, tore his hamstring on the first day of filming. Not on a complex stunt sequence. Not during a particularly dangerous fight choreography rehearsal. Just on day 1, doing what he does in the Philippine heat. He was 59 minutes into his third film of 2025, shooting in the rainy season in the Philippine jungle, and his body had apparently decided it had an opinion about the schedule. Adkins recounted this story in an interview with genuine amusement and said, in direct response to being asked what lessons he learned from the experience of developing and shooting the film, that it taught him he was getting old. He followed that immediately with the observation that the hamstring injury forced him to use a stunt double for some of the kick sequences, something he described as something he absolutely hates doing. For a man whose entire artistic identity is built on the authenticity of performing his own physical work, being forced to hand off a kick to someone else because his leg had decided to stage a rebellion on the first morning of shooting is the equivalent of a concert pianist being told they have to let someone else play the difficult passages. It is simultaneously frustrating and mortifying, and Adkins treated it with exactly the dry humor that the situation deserved. He had already torn the hamstring, there was nothing to be done about it, and as he said himself, you just have to keep going. And keep going he did, for the entire remaining duration of the shoot. The second great production story involves the Philippine rainy season and what it did to the set. The production made the decision to film during what is objectively not the ideal time of year to be building outdoor film sets in the Philippines. The rainy season in the Philippines is not a gentle, intermittent drizzle situation. It is serious, sustained, tropical rainfall that comes with genuine force and changes everything around it. Adkins described the experience of filming during this season with characteristically blunt honesty. He acknowledged openly that filming in the rainy season was not a very smart choice, but immediately followed that up by saying that it looked good. Because here's the thing about rainy season Philippines, the rainfall does something remarkable to the landscape. It makes everything green and wet and atmospheric and cinematic in a way that you genuinely cannot fake or recreate artificially on a $2 million budget. The heavy rain that soaked the cast and crew and made everyone miserable also turned the prison camp environment into something that looked raw and real and genuinely oppressive on camera. But it went further than that. The set washed away. Not once. A few times. The physical prison camp set that the production team had built was washed away by the rain on multiple occasions during filming, requiring repairs and reconstruction that nobody had budgeted for. Adkins described this with the tone of someone who has spent enough time on difficult film productions to understand that these things happen and that complaining about them changes nothing. The set washed away, the crew fixed it, and filming continued. The remarkable part is that the finished film gives absolutely no indication that the set spent portions of its existence disassembled at the bottom of a hill. The third memorable element of the production involves the typhoons. Director Louis Mandylor, in his own interviews about the film, spoke about the typhoons that threatened production during their time in the Philippines. Dealing with the practical reality of shooting an outdoor war film in a country that sits directly in a major typhoon corridor added a layer of genuine danger and unpredictability to the production that nobody on a studio blockbuster would ever have to manage. When a typhoon warning comes in during production, you cannot simply continue filming and hope for the best. Everything has to be secured, the cast and crew have to be accounted for, and the entire production schedule has to be renegotiated around a force of nature that does not care about your release date. The fourth behind-the-scenes element that generated its own kind of entertainment was the dynamic between Scott Adkins and his old collaborator Louis Mandylor and their new working relationship. The two men had spent years together as co-stars on the Debt Collector films, where they were equals in front of the camera, developing their scenes together and often disagreeing playfully about how things should go. Now Mandylor was behind the camera and Adkins was in front of it, and the dynamic had shifted in a way that both of them found both comfortable and occasionally funny. Adkins described their communication style as being built on a shared sense of humor. The same sense of humor, he said, which is why they worked so naturally together both on those earlier films and on this one. Mandylor, for his part, described Adkins's acting abilities to interviewers with a kind of exasperated affection, essentially saying that the world still has not fully understood how gifted an actor Adkins actually is, that underneath the incredible physical performer is a genuine thespian who simply does not get the credit he deserves. He said he kept telling Adkins directly that he was an incredible actor and that people needed to see more of that side of him, and that the response he got from Adkins was typically self-deprecating and typically British. The fifth element of behind-the-scenes entertainment came from the simple reality of having Donald Cerrone on set. Cerrone is not an actor by primary profession, he is one of the most celebrated mixed martial artists of his generation. A man who has fought in the UFC for over a decade and who carries himself with the easy, relaxed confidence of someone who has genuinely faced real physical danger and found it manageable. Putting that personality inside a World War II prison camp set, in full period costume, surrounded by professional actors and martial arts choreographers running carefully rehearsed sequences, is the kind of fish-out-of-water situation that generates natural comedy. Cerrone himself is well known in the MMA world for his personality, relaxed, playful, direct, and completely lacking in pretension. The idea of a man who has fought Conor McGregor and Rafael dos Anjos having to remember his blocking marks and hit his camera angles in a 1940s prisoner of war drama is genuinely amusing to picture, and reviewers who commented on his performance noted that he brought an authentic physical presence and rough credibility to his role that no amount of acting training could have manufactured. What all of these stories share is the same underlying truth about what it actually takes to make a film outside the comfortable infrastructure of a major studio system. You shoot in the rainy season because that is when you can get the locations you need. The set washes away and you build it back. The lead actor tears his hamstring on the first morning and you adjust the choreography and keep rolling. Typhoons roll in and you wait them out and then get back to work. And somehow, through all of it, through every piece of chaos and improvisation and creative problem-solving, you end up with something that audiences around the world watch and enjoy and recommend to their friends. A $2 million film that looks like it cost 10 times that, shot by people who were too determined to let the conditions beat them. Prisoner of War, 2025, complete cultural and historical details. The world the film is born from, a historical foundation. To fully understand Prisoner of War as a piece of cinema, you cannot simply watch it as an action film and move on. Every single element in this story, the setting, the power structure, the cruelty of the camp, the behavior of the guards, the psychology of the antagonists, the desperation of the prisoners, and even the strange moment of warrior respect at the film's climax, is rooted in real history, real culture, and real documented human behavior. This film did not invent its world. It drew it directly from one of the most painful and historically significant chapters of the entire Second World War. To understand the film properly, you have to understand the world it came from, and that world stretches back decades before 1942 and reaches forward into every corner of the Pacific War. The film opens in April of 1942. That date is not a random choice. April 9, 1942, is one of the most significant and devastating dates in the history of both the Philippines and the United States military. It is the date of the formal surrender of the Allied forces on the Bataan Peninsula, and it is the date that set in motion what would become known to history as the Bataan Death March. The film places its story right in the middle of that historical moment, using the impending Death March as the ticking clock that drives the escape narrative forward. The Philippines, where the film is set and where it was actually filmed, had a colonial history that made its position in the Second World War uniquely complicated and deeply tragic. Spain had colonized the Philippines beginning in 1521, and the islands remained under Spanish control for over 350 years. In 1898, following the Spanish-American War, the United States won the islands from Spain as part of the war's settlement, and the Philippines became an American colonial possession. This transition was not peaceful. A Filipino revolutionary movement that had been fighting for independence from Spain quickly found itself fighting against the United States instead, and the Philippine-American War that followed was brutal and costly on both sides. But by the time the Second World War arrived, the Philippines had been living under American governance for 4 decades, and the relationship between Filipinos and Americans had developed into something far more complex than a simple colonial arrangement. The United States had promised the Philippines full independence, and many Filipinos had genuinely invested their loyalty in that promise. When Japan attacked, thousands of Filipino soldiers fought alongside American troops not just because they were ordered to, but because they were defending a future they had been promised and believed in. Japan's attack on the Philippines came on December 8, 1941, just 9 hours after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Because the Philippines sits on the Asian side of the international date line, December 8 there corresponds to December 7 in the United States. The attack devastated the American Air Forces in the Pacific almost immediately, destroying much of the American aircraft on the ground at Clark Air Base before they could even get airborne. With air superiority gone, the Japanese were able to land ground forces on Luzon with relative ease, and the American and Filipino defenders found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from any realistic possibility of reinforcement. General Douglas MacArthur, who commanded the American and Filipino forces in the Philippines, made the decision to withdraw his forces to the Bataan Peninsula on the western side of Luzon, intending to hold the peninsula until reinforcements could arrive from the United States. The plan was built on an assumption that proved tragically wrong, that significant American reinforcement was coming. In reality, the American military had made the strategic decision that the war in Europe was the priority, and the Philippines was left to fight with what it already had. The soldiers in Bataan were not told this. They fought for 4 months believing that help was on its way. More than 80,000 American and Filipino soldiers retreated to the Bataan Peninsula and prepared to make their stand. The conditions they fought under were almost incomprehensibly difficult. Food was already rationed before the siege even began, and as the months passed, the rations were cut repeatedly until men were surviving on less than 1,000 calories a day. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and other tropical diseases tore through the ranks with devastating efficiency. Medical supplies were inadequate and ran out quickly. General MacArthur himself evacuated the Philippines on March 11, 1942, under orders from President Roosevelt, leaving his soldiers behind with the famous declaration that he would return. For the men still in Bataan, that declaration was cold comfort. On April 3, 1942, the Japanese launched a massive final offensive against the already severely weakened Allied lines. The starving, disease-ridden defenders who had been fighting for 4 months on fractional rations had almost nothing left with which to resist. Within days, resistance collapsed. On April 9, 1942, Major General Edward King made the decision to surrender, the largest surrender of American forces since the Civil War. Approximately 12,000 Americans and 63,000 Filipinos became prisoners of war on that single day. What followed that surrender is what the film Prisoner of War exists inside of. The Japanese military was not prepared for the sheer number of prisoners they now held, and what happened to those prisoners over the weeks and months that followed became one of the defining atrocities of the entire conflict in the Pacific. The Bataan Death March, the historical horror at the heart of the film. The Bataan Death March is mentioned in the film as the fate that all the prisoners will face if they cannot escape in time, and that reference carries enormous weight for anyone who understands what the Death March actually was. After the surrender on April 9, 1942, the Japanese military began moving their approximately 75,000 Filipino and American prisoners from the southern tip of the Bataan Peninsula northward to prison camps. The distance was approximately 65 to 66 miles, roughly 106 kilometers. In normal circumstances, that is a long walk but a manageable one for healthy, well-fed soldiers with adequate rest and water. The prisoners undertaking the Bataan Death March were none of those things. They were already severely weakened by 4 months of malnutrition and disease. Many were suffering from active malaria, dysentery, and other illnesses. They had just endured the psychological devastation of surrender. And the Japanese military provided almost no food, almost no water, almost no medical care, and absolutely no mercy along the way. The march lasted between 5 and 10 days depending on where along the route a prisoner joined it. During those days, prisoners who fell or collapsed were beaten. Those who could not get back up were killed, shot, bayonet, or beheaded, depending on the mood of whichever guards happened to be nearby. Prisoners were denied water even when they were passing sources of fresh water, and those who broke ranks to drink were killed. The tropical heat of the Philippines summer made the dehydration even more lethal. Men were crammed into suffocating metal boxcars for portions of the journey, packed so tightly that they could barely breathe, with temperatures inside the cars reaching life-threatening levels. Estimates of how many people died during the march itself range from 5,000 to over 10,000. Thousands more died in the prison camps after arriving, from starvation, untreated disease, and continued mistreatment. The Bataan Death March became one of the most internationally recognized symbols of Japanese wartime brutality, and resulted in war crimes convictions after the war's end. General Masaharu Homma, who commanded the Japanese forces that carried out the march, was convicted of war crimes related to it, and executed by firing squad in 1946. The film places its entire narrative inside the space between the surrender and the march, the period when prisoners were being held in camps, when their transfer to something worse was imminent, and when escape felt both impossible and absolutely necessary. That urgency is not a dramatic invention. It is a historically documented reality. The Japanese prisoner of war camp system and the cultural forces behind it. To understand why the Japanese treated their prisoners the way they did, you have to understand a cultural and philosophical framework that was centuries old but had been radically transformed and weaponized by the Imperial Japanese state in the decades leading up to World War II. The concept at the center of that framework is Bushido, a Japanese word that translates directly as the way of the warrior. Bushido had its origins in the samurai class of feudal Japan, the warrior aristocracy that dominated Japanese political and military life for centuries before the Meiji Restoration of 1868. In its original form, Bushido was a moral code governing the conduct of samurai warriors. It emphasized loyalty to one's lord, personal honor, martial skill, righteous conduct, courage, respect, honesty, and the willingness to face death without fear. The concept of dying with honor rather than living with shame was central to the original Bushido tradition, and the practice of seppuku, ritual self-disembowelment, was the ultimate expression of that principle, chosen by warriors who faced defeat or dishonor rather than allowing themselves to be captured or humiliated. The 7 core virtues of traditional Bushido are Gi, meaning righteousness and justice, U, meaning courage not reckless but the strength to act rightly in the face of fear, Jin, meaning benevolence and compassion, the idea that true strength is tempered with kindness, Rei, meaning respect and proper conduct, Makoto, meaning honesty and sincerity, Meo, meaning honor and reputation, and Chugi, meaning loyalty and devotion. These are genuinely noble values in their original context, and they shaped Japanese culture, art, literature, governance, and social structure for centuries. But in the Meiji period and particularly in the militarist decades of the early 20th century, Bushido was systematically reinterpreted, distorted, and weaponized by the Japanese imperial state to serve very different purposes. The individual loyalty to one's feudal lord that was at the heart of original Bushido was replaced with absolute, unquestioning loyalty to the emperor, who was presented as a divine figure standing above ordinary human authority. The acceptance of death that traditional Bushido contained was twisted into a glorification of self-sacrifice for the state and a contempt for survival. And the treatment of surrender, which in traditional Bushido could be nuanced and contextual, became in the imperial military framework an absolute taboo. Surrender was shame, and those who surrendered were objects of contempt unworthy of basic human dignity. The 1941 Senjinkan, or Code of Battlefield Conduct, was issued to all Japanese soldiers and made this prohibition against surrender a formal military doctrine. It stated explicitly that soldiers should not allow themselves to be taken prisoner, and that death was preferable to capture. Japan had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention covering the treatment of prisoners of war but had refused to ratify it, arguing that the concept of surrendering was contrary to the beliefs of Japanese soldiers. This philosophical position meant that Allied prisoners were viewed through the lens of an ideology that considered their very existence as prisoners to be a form of shameful failure. They had done something, in the minds of their captors, that no honorable warrior would do. And that view translated directly into the treatment those prisoners received. The film captures this psychology with considerable care. Lieutenant Colonel Ito is not presented as simply cruel in a cartoonish way. He is shown as a man who believes in a rigidly hierarchical code in which the prisoners beneath him have forfeited their dignity by surrendering, and who believes that demonstrating Japanese superiority over them is a moral and cultural duty. The underground fighting matches that Ito organizes are not just sadistic entertainment. In his worldview, they are demonstrations of Japanese martial supremacy over Western softness. What he does not expect, and what begins to genuinely disturb the foundations of his ideology, is that Wright refuses to fit the role that ideology assigns to him. Wright fights back. Wright wins. Wright does not break. And Ito, despite everything, finds himself recognizing in Wright the qualities that Bushido at its deepest level actually demands respect for: genuine martial skill, genuine courage, and genuine refusal to surrender even when surrender might seem rational. This is the cultural tension at the center of the film's relationship between its two main characters, and it is rooted entirely in real historical and philosophical dynamics that actually existed between Japanese military culture and the Allied prisoners who found themselves inside it. The Filipino experience, a nation in the middle. One of the most important and often overlooked cultural dimensions of Prisoner of War is the Filipino element, represented in the film by Sergeant Gabriel Villanueva and the nurse Teresa. These characters are not peripheral additions to an otherwise American and British story. They represent something historically vital: the Filipino people who were caught in the middle of a war being fought across their own homeland by foreign powers, and who made the choice to resist the occupation at enormous personal risk. The Japanese military, when it occupied the Philippines, initially framed its conquest as a liberation, an Asian nation freeing other Asians from Western colonial rule. Japan promoted the concept of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a political and propaganda framework that promised Asian solidarity and independence from European and American domination. For some Filipinos, this framing had a surface appeal. The Philippines had been a colonial possession of the United States, after all, and the promise of genuine independence was one that some Filipinos had been waiting to hear. But the reality of Japanese occupation shattered that framing almost immediately. The Japanese military treated the Filipino population with much of the same contempt it directed at its prisoners of war. Forced labor was widespread. Filipino civilians were subjected to brutal reprisals for any suspected resistance activity. Women were forced into sexual slavery. Villages were burned. The occupation was experienced not as liberation but as a different and equally oppressive form of colonial domination, one that came with a level of active violence that the American colonial government had never practiced on the same scale. As a result, the vast majority of the Filipino population chose resistance. An extensive guerrilla movement developed across the islands, organized into dozens of distinct resistance groups that operated from the mountains and jungles. These groups conducted intelligence operations, sabotage, raids on Japanese supply lines, and direct military engagements. They sheltered Allied soldiers who had evaded capture. They gathered information on Japanese troop movements and transmitted it to Allied forces through underground networks. Historians estimate that 1 in 10 guerrilla fighters in the Philippine resistance was a woman, though many more women served in support roles, as nurses, as messengers, as spies carrying intelligence through Japanese checkpoints, as providers of food and medicine to fighters in the field. The character of Teresa in the film is directly inspired by this historical reality. A Filipino nurse working inside a Japanese prison camp, secretly providing extra medical care to prisoners and eventually participating in an escape plan. This is not a dramatic invention. It is a character type that existed in documented reality throughout the occupation. Filipino medical workers, teachers, and ordinary civilians regularly took extraordinary personal risks to help both Allied prisoners and Filipino resistance fighters during the occupation, knowing that discovery meant torture and death. The film's decision to make the escape plan a collaborative effort between a British officer, American soldiers, and a Filipino nurse is historically resonant in a way that matters. The actual liberation of the Philippines was not achieved by any single nationality or any single force. It was achieved through a combination of American military power, Filipino guerrilla resistance, and the sustained sacrifice of soldiers from multiple Allied nations. The film captures that collaborative spirit in miniature, and it gives the Filipino contribution the visibility and respect it deserves. Martial arts culture and the forbidden technique. The film's martial arts dimension is not merely an action device. It is tied to real traditions of martial arts knowledge that have deep cultural roots across Asia. The concept of a forbidden technique, a fighting method so powerful or so unorthodox that it exists outside the mainstream traditions and is therefore suppressed or hidden, is not a Hollywood invention. It reflects a real feature of the history of martial arts across China, Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia. Throughout the history of martial arts in East Asia, certain techniques were considered too dangerous, too lethal, or too philosophically controversial for open teaching. Knowledge was often guarded carefully within specific lineages of master and student, passed down through chains of personal trust rather than public instruction. Techniques developed in one tradition would sometimes be deliberately hidden from practitioners of rival schools, not just for competitive reasons but because the techniques themselves carried philosophical and cultural weight that made their transmission a matter of deep seriousness. The idea that Wright's techniques were developed through training in Hong Kong is also culturally specific and deliberate. Hong Kong in the early to mid-20th century was one of the most significant crossroads of martial arts knowledge in the world. It was a place where Chinese, Japanese, British, and Southeast Asian traditions intersected, where masters from mainland China had brought rare and hidden lineages of knowledge when fleeing various upheavals on the mainland, and where the exchange and synthesis of different martial arts traditions happened with unusual freedom. The notion of a British officer training in rare martial arts in Hong Kong during the 1930s is entirely plausible as a historical scenario, and it gives the film's martial arts narrative a geographical and cultural anchor that is real rather than invented. Ito's recognition of the forbidden techniques adds another layer of cultural depth to the film's conflict. As a Japanese military officer deeply versed in his own country's martial traditions, Ito would understand what he was seeing when Wright fought, not just athleticism, but technique that belonged to a specific lineage of knowledge. The fact that he recognizes the tradition behind Wright's fighting is what elevates Wright from simply being a dangerous prisoner to being something Ito feels genuine philosophical awe toward. Within the framework of Bushido and Japanese martial culture, recognizing mastery and paying it respect is not weakness, it is one of the highest expressions of the warrior's code. Ito's final decision to let Wright go is therefore not a betrayal of his own values. It is, paradoxically, an expression of the very deepest ones. The relationship between Britain and the Pacific War. Why a British officer? The choice to make the film's protagonist a British Royal Air Force officer rather than an American soldier is culturally significant and historically grounded. Britain's involvement in the Pacific War is one of the most underrepresented and poorly understood aspects of the conflict in popular culture, particularly in American-produced war films that tend to center the American experience exclusively. The British Empire had enormous strategic stakes in the Pacific and Southeast Asian theaters of the Second World War. British forces fought in Burma, Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong, and across the wider region. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 was one of the most catastrophic British military defeats in history, with approximately 85,000 British, Indian, and Australian soldiers surrendering to a Japanese force that was significantly smaller in number. Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. British prisoners of war were subjected to the same brutal treatment as American and Filipino prisoners. Forced labor on projects including the infamous Burma-Thailand Railway, known as the Death Railway, where tens of thousands of Allied prisoners and Asian laborers died building a rail line through the jungle for Japanese military use. British prisoners captured in the Philippines were a real historical phenomenon. Allied forces in the region included British, Australian, Dutch, and Filipino soldiers alongside Americans, and the camps that held them were multinational environments where men from very different cultures and backgrounds found themselves sharing the same conditions of confinement, starvation, and forced labor. Wing Commander James Wright, a British RAF officer shot down over the Bataan Peninsula, is therefore not a historically implausible character. He represents the genuinely international nature of the Allied war effort in the Pacific that most American war films completely omit. Cultural legacy: how these events are remembered today. The historical events depicted in Prisoner of War carry enormous ongoing cultural significance in the Philippines, in the United States, in Japan, and in the broader international conversation about war, memory, and justice. In the Philippines, the Bataan Peninsula remains a site of profound national meaning. Araw ng Kagitingan, the Day of Valor, is a Philippine national holiday observed every April 9th, marking the anniversary of the fall of Bataan and honoring the Filipinos and Americans who fought and died there. The Bataan Death March is not merely a historical footnote in Filipino culture. It is a national wound that shaped the country's identity through the 20th century and continues to be passed down through generations. Monuments, museums, memorials, and annual commemorations mark the sites along the march route to this day. In the United States, the Bataan Death March became a defining symbol of Japanese wartime brutality that shaped American public opinion and popular memory of the Pacific War for decades after its conclusion. American survivors of the march formed veterans organizations that kept the memory alive throughout the post-war period. The annual Bataan Memorial Death March, a long-distance march held at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, continues as an annual event attended by thousands of participants including active-duty military personnel, veterans, and civilians who walk the route in honor of those who were forced to march it under duress. In Japan, the memory and legacy of these events has been one of the most contested and painful areas of post-war historical discourse. Japan's official reckoning with the war crimes committed by its military during the Second World War has been uneven and frequently challenged by both domestic and international critics. War crimes trials conducted by the Allied powers after the war resulted in convictions and executions of senior Japanese military figures, including the commander responsible for the Bataan campaign, but many argue that accountability never reached as far as it should have, and that Japan's post-war education system has not always presented these events with the historical honesty that the victims deserve. This ongoing tension between Japan's national memory and the memories of those who suffered under its wartime military is part of the cultural context that gives a film like Prisoner of War its continuing relevance. The decision by the film's creators to give Lieutenant Colonel Ito a moment of genuine warrior's respect at the end, to allow him a gesture of complicated honor rather than simply defeating him and leaving him as a flat villain, reflects a mature engagement with this cultural complexity. It does not excuse or minimize the atrocities that Ito committed or oversaw. It acknowledges that human beings who commit terrible acts within a particular cultural and ideological framework can still possess genuine personal qualities that exist alongside those acts, and that the relationship between individuals on opposite sides of a war can be more complex than simple hero and villain narratives allow. The cultural significance of the film itself. Beyond the history it depicts, Prisoner of War carries its own cultural significance as an artifact of contemporary filmmaking. It is a film set in the Philippines, partially filmed in the Philippines, featuring Filipino actors and crew members in significant roles, and centering a Filipino character as an essential part of its escape narrative. At a time when conversations about representation and authenticity in storytelling have become central to discussions of global cinema, this film's choices are culturally meaningful. Filipino cinema and Filipino participation in international productions have historically been underrepresented and undervalued relative to the country's rich filmmaking tradition and the deep cultural resonance of the events of the Pacific War for Filipino national identity. The presence of Gabby Garcia in a meaningful role, the use of genuine Filipino locations, and the film's honest engagement with what the occupation meant for the Filipino people all contribute to a film that treats the Philippines as more than just a backdrop for a Western protagonist's story. Villanueva and Teresa are not sidekicks. They are full participants in the film's moral and dramatic world, and their presence honors the historical reality that the liberation of the Philippines was never solely an American achievement. It was something that ordinary Filipinos fought for, bled for, and died for every single day between 1942 and 1945. That is the cultural and historical world that Prisoner of War 2025 inhabits. And understanding that world transforms the film from a straightforward action thriller into something considerably more significant, a story about survival, resistance, and human dignity drawn from one of the most important and most painful chapters of the 20th century.